It's Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. Hello, and welcome to Monster Mondays. I'm Jeff Arbuckle, co-host of the podcast Film Seizure, that you can catch each Wednesday morning at filmseizure.com or at a number of podcast providers online. On Halloween night 1992, England's BBC One had a spooky treat for viewers. That treat, or in some ways I guess it was kind of more of a trick, was the horror mockumentary TV movie Ghostwatch. It was the only time it ever aired on British television, despite it getting aired overseas and now easily available via streaming sites. This mockumentary featured three real-life and fairly well-respected British television hosts, or presenters as they're called there. We have Michael Parkinson, who was a television presenter going back to the 60s, and he'd worked on several current events programs. In 1971, he had his own self-titled talk show called Parkinson. Then we have Sarah Green. She still works on British television today. Her earliest days as a presenter was on the extremely long-running children's program Blue Peter. At the age of 22, she was the youngest presenter on that series. And Green occasionally acted, too, appearing in the 1985 Doctor Who serial Attack of the Cybermen. Her husband, Mike Smith, typically known as Smithy on air, is the third real-life presenter in Ghostwatch. He was mostly a radio guy going back to the mid-70s, but also worked on TV in the 80s as a presenter on the popular music series Top of the Pops. He was also one of the main presenters for BBC TV during the 1985 mega concert Live Aid. Now, Ghostwatch aired similarly to how Orson Welles' dramatic performance of The War of the Worlds on radio did back in the 30s. Many people who may have missed out on the first few minutes of the show to see it was under the banner of the dramatic anthology series on the BBC believed that they were watching, or what they were watching was real. I'll talk a little bit more about the heavy controversy that the show caused, but I think it's safe to say that that since there was a very popular crime series called Crime Watch that operated similarly to Unsolved Mysteries or 2020 or Dateline NBC here in the States, I think it was safe for people to believe that this would have been somewhat taken seriously. That was, kind of a factual docuseries. So you have Crime Watch, Ghostwatch. So people likely took Ghostwatch somewhat seriously, like I said. But Ghostwatch was written by Welsh horror writer Stephen Volk. He would later write a short story called 3110, which was basically a sequel to Ghostwatch. And while Ghostwatch was by far his most memorable work, he never really intended it to be a fake documentary or a hoax. Originally, it was going to be a mini-series for the BBC, but after it was sold to the BBC, the series producer didn't really think it was going to work as a six-parter, so Volk reworked it into a 90-minute dramatic presentation, but starring the recognizable presenters, and is often brought up in conversations in connection to other BBC TV hoax called Seance with British illusionist Darren Brown, and people think there are several similarities also found within the Blair Witch Project, but co-director Eduardo Sanchez has gone on record saying he had not seen Ghostwatch until after Blair Witch was released. In 2020, a British movie called Host most definitely was inspired by Ghostwatch, even dropping in a Zoom caller ID reference of 31/10/1992, which was the date of the only airing of Ghostwatch on BBC. But let's talk about the plot of this mockumentary, and then we'll circle back around to the more controversial aspects of the airing itself. The quote-unquote documentary, as it was, opens like any other investigative journalist shows with Michael Parkinson introducing the house in which Ghost House will do their investigation. It's a small house with two young girls and a single mother living within it. Videotape evidence from a university investigation of the paranormal happenings going on there shows that the two girls were kind of having late night poltergeist events with loud banging, one of the girls' legs being grabbed, stuff being thrown around the room, and so forth. And so Parkinson welcomes us to the first ever live investigation on Ghostwatch. In the studio, he is joined by a parapsychologist whose evidence is shown throughout this. She was part of that university team that worked within the house for a while. And then that's where we also have Mike Smith, Smithy, who will be manning the phones with calls from viewers to tell their ghost stories. Now, on site, we have Craig Charles, an actor from shows like Red Dwarf and Coronation Street. He's basically there working as a interviewer. He's working outside of the house, and he's there to be kind of the comedic relief, I guess. He is really playing himself, and he was a comedian as well as an actor. So, he's there kind of cracking wise with the people outside who've kind of gathered, or talking to other people who are from the neighborhood and stuff. But he's not really taking the events all that seriously at all. Now, we do meet Pamela early and her daughters, Suzanne and Kim. They're interviewed by Sarah, who is there kind of doing the investigation herself. And she talks about how they can't really sleep. They can't rest. They feel like something is not friendly in their house. And they refer to this entity as pipes, because she would say, oh, it's only the pipes that are rattling or knocking or whatever, because it is an old house. So one of the daughters, the younger of the two, Kim, just kind of took to calling the entity pipes. Pipes is here. It's just pipes. It's, everything's fine. But for the most part, this movie carries on like a real nonfiction journalist program. A woman calls into the show, is saying that the film that they showed of the girls being attacked at the start looked like that there was a woman or something, some sort of dark entity, ghostly shape in what appeared to be a black dress, kind of appearing in the footage that the parapsychologist, Dr. Pascoe, said that she had never really seen before, despite studying the film many times over. She even, that keeps coming up throughout the course of the program. And she does eventually review it to say, I think this is just shadows or whatever. Now, Sarah Green is the main location presenter. Like I said, she's going to be the one who will be inside the house. And there are a couple of real BBC technicians who are kind of seen on screen here. And they kind of become, at times, characters themselves. They'll be filming and recording the events of the evening. And they talk about how they first encountered pipes. One of the girls looked into a boarded up basement entrance and claimed that she saw pipes looking back at her. They talk about like the first time they heard the noises and all of that stuff. The younger of the two girls, Kim, was the one who claimed to be the first one who actually saw pipes, and she drew a picture of what she saw. The other girl, Suzanne, her notebook had a ton of creepy and terrible writings within it, so much so that her mother believed that she was doing this either for attention or was just going off the normal path and being a bad girl, and even mentioned that she had thought about slapping her over what was written in the book. Now, speaking of that basement entrance, it's boarded up because Pamela was trapped in the basement one night. You see, her ex-husband used to do his own photography and use the basement as what they call a glory hole, which is where he would develop his film and all of that stuff. Well, she got trapped inside there, couldn't open the door, and before the girls came to get her out, she said that she felt the presence of a very bad man in the basement with her. And when Pamela tried to get help from others to figure out how to deal with this poltergeist or this activity, it turned into a media circus with you had newspapers, you had tabloids and all of that stuff that she said that pretty much always made her and the two girls come off as either crazy or stupid. But when she turned to TV and she started talking to Dr. Pascoe about it, that's when she could get the attention of Ghostwatch. Now, back in the studio, Dr. Pascoe and Parkinson play a recording of a ghostly voice that she captured in the house. The growling voice is a guttural and almost animalistic in sound, and the voice comes through Suzanne herself, but she can't recreate it on command. Dr. Pascoe even says that they hypnotized her and she couldn't reproduce that voice. It could only be produced in during certain tests. Like they would do a thing where they would take away, like a sensory deprivation test. She could do it then. But, Suzanne also gets these lesion-like scrapes and cuts on her face. These occur after she feels like something is basically, quote-unquote, all over her and seemingly physically oppressing her. Now, Dr. Pascoe says that Suzanne is really kind of a classic poltergeist focus because of her entering into puberty. She's introverted because of that. At times she's closed off because of the changes going on with her. So it really does open her up to these types of potential poltergeist hauntings. Now, the area around the Earlys' home on this fictional Fox Hill Drive has had some spooky business over the years. A lady tells the story of a pregnant black Labrador, for example, that was found dead with the Labrador's pups, fetuses basically spread all around this backyard. No idea how it could have died or how the fetuses could have been extracted and spread around the yard like that. They also talked to a priest who attempted to exorcise the house, but was unsuccessful and felt a constant presence trying to keep him away and doing things like making his hands smell like blood. Inside the house, Sarah discovers a perfectly round circle of moisture in the living room that couldn't have been made by any normal instance of leaking water or whatever. In fact, it was under a table. Sarah soon starts hearing noises like scratches and knocking sounds. The girls' drawings are tossed around the kitchen. However, when investigating the pounding and the knocking sound, they see that it's Suzanne making the banging sound from within a closet. And Suzanne cries and pleads that it was not her doing the banging sounds, but she also then later says that she's only giving people what they wanted. They wanted a paranormal activity, so she was going to make it happen. Now, Michael Parkinson at this point becomes determined that this is all a hoax. And he ends up wanting to kind of interview Suzanne and find out if she's been the entire origin of this supposed haunting. And like a good old white British guy, he basically badgers her with questions, despite her crying and screaming that she doesn't want to talk about this. He then calls the little girl a fraud directly to her mother. But calls continue coming into the show about seeing a black figure in the footage of the investigation that has a skull-like bald head, a description that Kim gave Dr. Pascoe in her earlier investigations and interviews with the family. In addition to that, a caller comes in saying that their glass table exploded, their clocks have all stopped, and their kids refuse to go to bed or stop watching the show. Dr. Pascoe basically tries to get the caller to take photographic evidence of everything, but Michael Parkinson ends up cutting her off and keeps the show going, now believing that he's just getting hoaxed all over the place. The little girl is causing all of the incidents inside the house. People are calling in, telling wild stories because it's Halloween night. It's a Saturday night. People are getting drunk, all of that stuff. But back at the house, we begin hearing the sounds of cats everywhere. They're scratching at the walls. They're meowing. They're yowling. Sounds like that they're on the roof or inside the walls. The scratches and lesions return to Suzanne's face. She's hot to the touch, like she has a fever, despite it being cold inside the house. Sarah also starts seeing things in mirrors, like someone standing behind her trying to hide from plain sight. A woman calls into the show telling the story of Mother Seddons, a child murderer who became a boogeyman of sorts for kids who wouldn't go to bed when she was younger. Now, Mother Seddons ended up living on what became Fox Hill Road. Another caller reveals a previous owner sublet a room there illegally to a nephew named Tunstall, who was a child molester, had been in jail but was released. He said he should have never been allowed into a neighborhood because of what he was convicted for. But Tunstall would end up later killing himself after a terrible bout with delusions, one of which being that he felt that there was a woman inside of his body that was making him do things or making him act certain ways. He would wear black dresses and stuff, which is why whenever somebody calls in about seeing that black figure in the video evidence that they have, they can't decide if it's a man or a woman because what they're wearing looks like a dress, even though the features of what would be a person look to be more masculine. But when he hanged himself, Tunstall wasn't found for 12 days, and his many cats, I think they said he had like at least a dozen cats, were heard screaming, and later it was found that they had begun going to work, quote unquote, on his face, which indicates they were biting and scratching at his face. Now, the Early's house gets more and more dangerous and intense at this point. Sarah and Pamela try to get the girls out of the house, but Suzanne starts talking like a monster, and Kim removes the eyes of her stuffed bunny and drowns it in the sink, saying that it was bad, that it was a bad bunny. The girls both hide and disappear at different times. One of the technicians is harmed by a broken mirror that falls out of the boarded up doorway to the basement. The feed is interrupted and becomes faulty. It cuts out, it returns when people don't realize it. And when the footage from within the house is eventually restored, Dr. Pascoe realizes that, and kind of sees through an illusion, that it's earlier footage making people believe that everything was fine inside the house when it most definitely is not. And Dr. Pascoe ends up saying that by broadcasting this investigation, they have created a nationwide seance that is essentially letting the poltergeist out of its confined setting of that home. Pamela, the injured technician, and Kim have all been evacuated, but Sarah, another cameraman, and Suzanne are still stuck inside the house, and they see the infrared feed from the cameraman in the darkened house within the studio, and that gets broadcast out. As the activity in the house starts to pick back up again, it also affects the Ghostwatch studio. And inside the house, Sarah tries freeing what she thinks is Suzanne from behind the basement door, but she's sucked into it and locked inside. At the now empty studio where everybody has evacuated or gone missing, Michael Parkinson is wandering about and muttering things to himself and starts saying some things that indicate that he is now possessed by the entity that haunted Fox Hill Drive. Now let's get to 3 things I like about Ghostwatch. First, I mentioned that this carries on like a real journalist program, and I mentioned shows like 2020 or Dateline NBC over here in the States, and these are the shows that I'm most familiar with in these kinds of settings, and sometimes they would do spooky things, but this Ghostwatch, there is a dryness to it that 30 plus years later seems kind of quaint, and as an adult who not only knows that it's a mockumentary, but also would be able to kind of see through a lot of what they're doing, it's obviously staged. However, I do like that this movie does decide to go dry, because it does come across as if I were, say, I don't know, between the ages of 12 and 15, and as gullible as a dumb kid can be at that age, I do think this would have been somewhat frightening to me, or at least a fun watch, especially for a Halloween night. It is very much of its time and place. It is very British in the way it presents itself, but I like how it takes this approach for this kind of fun little Halloween treat. Why not pull the legs of some viewers and treat it as something that was real when it really isn't? But next, this entire mockumentary is not entirely made up out of thin air. It's actually based on a very famous late 70s poltergeist story. From 1977 to 1979, there were reports of various knocking, evil-sounding voices, and things moving on their own in what was known as the infield poltergeist. This was a similar situation of a single mother named Peggy Hodgson and her two young daughters, Janet and Margaret, reporting these very scary things. However, while this was investigated many, many times over by all sorts of paranormal investigators, it's not exactly clear if this was an elaborate hoax or a real tale of ghosts or something in between. And by the way, supposedly our favorite paranormal grifters, Ed and Lorraine Warren, claimed, of course, there was a presence there, and Ed was reported to even have told a member of the Society for Psychical Research that there was money to be made there in that house with these investigations. But anyway, stuff that was found to be hoaxed in various investigations by the little girls themselves is adapted here, as the girls are, particularly Suzanne, is caught making noises and such. And I do like that for 2/3 of this movie, it's either a hoax or it's Much Ado About Nothing in this investigation that Sarah is doing within the Fox Hill house. In fact, at one point, Sarah even says that it's more frightening to her that nothing is happening because she keeps waiting for something to happen. It's like she's so much on guard that it's bothering her more waiting for something to happen. She would rather either know for a fact that nothing is there or know for a fact that something is there. So it is kind of interesting how they do that. However, things do turn pretty spooky in the final 30 minutes. In fact, it goes pretty dark in the final third with two real-life people, Sarah Green and Michael Parkinson, both seemingly either attacked and harmed by the entity or possessed by the spirit of Pipes. I mean, by this point, I really hope people didn't think this was real when they were watching it back then, but when it ratchets up the intensity, it does a good job of being creepy in its final moments. And I do really appreciate that, because for an hour, you're kind of like Sarah. You're waiting for something to happen. And then when it finally does, it really happens. But thirdly, and this is such a silly thing, but I have to say it, every time the movie is in studio with the standard shot of Michael Parkinson on the right and Dr. Pascoe on the left, and they're talking to each other, and the camera is a standard, normal shot of both of them straight on, there's something like a fireplace or a mantle on the wall centered in frame beyond them. And over the mantle is a painting of a ghost, but it's not a spooky ghost or, something that would be like almost like a demonic entity or something like that. It's just a classic ghost under a white sheet. I mean, either Ghostwatch does not take its subject matter seriously, or Ghostwatch is not a real program on the BBC. It, along with these various tales of ghosts and unexplained incidents, is just, again, a bit of Halloween fun. But I do chuckle every time I saw that painting of the ghost under the sheet. I mean, it's so kiddie and silly. It had to be the number one sign if you tuned into it and saw that shot. Oh, this isn't real. Because, like I said, either it doesn't take its subject matter seriously or it's not a real program. I would like to think that on the BBC, they wouldn't air something that doesn't take its subject matter seriously. Now, before wrapping up, I do want to talk about the more negative controversy that Ghostwatch attracted. I had mentioned Orson Welles' reading of The War of the Worlds earlier, and yes, that caused quite the stir of people who didn't know or didn't listen to the first part of the broadcast that it was a dramatic presentation and not a real thing happening. It was sort of a similar situation with Ghostwatch. People didn't notice or miss the fact that this was a Screen One presentation. Screen One was a British anthology series, much like Masterpiece Theater or Mystery here in the United States. Some of the controversy was immediate. Some viewers, seeing the more documentary style, straight-laced presentation, thought what they were seeing was real. And there was even a rumor that came out that Sarah Green advertised it on her Saturday morning kids show called Going Live, but that was not true. In fact, multiple times throughout the show, they flashed the phone number to call in to tell your ghost story on Ghostwatch. It was the actual number that was used for call-in shows. It was the real BBC call-in line. However, when people called it during Ghostwatch, a recording played that basically said what you're watching is a dramatic interpretation or was not a real program. But thanks for your interest nonetheless, basically. But tabloids the very next day bashed the BBC for airing something that featured pretty disturbing ideas and concepts. So again, it was never run in reruns on BBC. And I mean, most of it is not that adult and themed or mature. However, it does deal with what the spirit is somebody who was a child molester and a pedophile. So that obviously, and I mean, I guess technically in the end, that spirit wins, right? So that is also something really bad to, maybe it would be a second thought about airing that again, or at least airing something that was presented as something real that featured these themes. I can understand why it was the cause of that. But maybe the real reason why the BBC opted to never air it again had less to do with criticism from the press or what was actually in the program and more to do with some very disturbing effects it had on a few viewers. Understand that this was aired after 9 p.m. That's what's called a watershed period, where the BBC basically says we carve out time on each evening that is for all viewers or is not for all viewers, things that are either drama time tables or they are real like they're real nonfiction timetable type stuff in their schedule. This aired outside of the watershed, which is the 9 o'clock hour on Saturday, and the 9 o'clock hour and beyond are meant for dramas on the BBC at that time. So, but there were some studies that were done on several children who watched the show and found that in the case of at least 6 children, and there was cases of post-traumatic stress disorder, and these were for kids that were aged between 10 and 14, and at least 4 of them were getting the PTSD from what they saw on Ghostwatch. There was a 7th case that did stem from yet another series, but these were some of the first truly observed and deeply studied cases of PTSD that was caused by a television program that was ever recorded. The worst case of mental trauma from the show came in the form of 18-year-old Martin Denham. Mr. Denham had learning disabilities and was basically deemed to have had the mental age of 13. Now, still, he was an adult, and he did work in a factory. However, he still lived at home, and he watched the program Ghostwatch, and 5 days later, he ultimately killed himself. The home he lived in with his parents had a heating system with pipes that creaked and knocked, and he feared the sounds were being caused by the house being haunted by the same entity that was on the program. And in his suicide note, he commented that if there were such a thing as a ghost, he will be with his parents forever as one. And his parents filed a motion with the Broadcasting Standards Commission and the High Court to hear their complaint about the program, claiming the disturbing material in the show had basically made him obsessed with the subject matter, and that it had an effect on somebody in his mental disposition. The report later filed that the BBC really did fail to do more than just simply hint at it being a deception. The report even went so far as to accuse Ghostwatch as being, quote, a deliberate attempt to cultivate a sense of menace, unquote. The BBC argued that they aired the show during the fictional drama slot, like I mentioned, but the broadcasting company held standards about what they could air when. But despite that, they issued the apology anyway. Now, I remember during roughly the same era here in the United States, there was a supposedly real exorcism being performed live on 2020 one night. While that show aired at like 10 p.m. on Fridays or whatever, so a little later than Ghostwatch would have aired on that Halloween night. But we do also have a culture here in the United States that I'm not sure the UK had at that time. Keep in mind, this was still the era of Mary Whitehouse and her conservative activist crusade over what was properly allowed to be consumed in media. She claimed it was to protect children, but she was really just wanting to label anyone who watched anything with too much gore or too much sex as being a deviant. So it might be safe to say most British audiences would have had difficulty parsing the show for what it was. And that said, it's still unfortunate that it could affect people the way it ultimately did. That wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. You can catch new episodes of Monster Mondays each Monday at filmseizure.com, but don't forget to follow Film Seizure at Facebook, Threads, Instagram, and Blue Sky. And you can also subscribe to Film Seizure to get both the Film Seizure podcast and Monster Mondays at your favorite podcast providers. And we also upload the episodes to YouTube. You can also check out my website, bmovieenema.com, to read new review articles every Friday morning. Next time, we hit the fields of rural Nebraska and become the targets of a child cult who worship He Who Walks Behind the Rose in the Stephen King adaptation of Children of the Corn. So until next week, stay spooky.